Hi folks, so welcome to this special edition of Science of the Times podcast episode. So today, Tim, our very own Tim, say hello Tim.
Hello Tim.
Is going to be debating with Leah and EJ, so details will be provided soon about the role or potential role of academia in addressing the biodiversity problem. In other words, can these three save the world? Would you trust this man with your future?
So without further ado, I'd like to invite EJ and Tim to have a seat, and we will begin the discussion. Okay, all right. So I would just like to start with inviting EJ to introduce herself and make any introductory comment about this topic.
Cool. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation. It's been exciting, Leah and Tim, to kind of get involved in chatting about this. I found the topic baffling because, to me, it's self-evident that academia has a role to play in addressing the biodiversity crisis. And in order to understand why I found it so baffling, maybe I'll just give a little brief introduction of where I came from. So I've been an interdisciplinary conservation scientist all of my adult life, since the age of 18. In fact, since I started studying pure and applied biology here in Oxford University, in what was then the zoology department. And that was a degree course that was sadly short-lived in the 1980s, that did kind of hardcore evolution and all that kind of thing, but also agriculture, forestry, and economics. And that was my undergraduate foundation. We skip forward 40 years, and the biology department is still, and perhaps even more, mixed in what we do. So there's still the pure evolutionary theory that I really enjoyed when I was an undergraduate, but we have people advising governments about pandemics, we have people talking, doing work on hen welfare, wind turbine design in order to stop birds bashing into wind turbines, antimicrobial resistance, and these people are working for and with and following the research interests and research questions of various external parties, including industry and government. So I was pondering, what is the difference between research on antimicrobial resistance, which I don't think would be sitting up here, and conservation science? Because antimicrobial resistance is also a major societal challenge. Perhaps it's using theory rather than generating new theory in the same way as perhaps us. And so all these others that I've named work with other natural and physical sciences or with medicine. Whereas conservation science works with social science to understand and influence complex social ecological systems. So maybe that's where the issue lies. However, the core of some social science fields has shared theory with a lot of what we think about in biology. So behavior, ecology, and economics, for example, all very similar in the theory that they share. So perhaps that's not the issue. Perhaps the issue is getting more into the qualitative social sciences, humanities, for example, and where the underpinning theory and approaches are more alien to the way we're trained as biologists. The first thing I would say to that, growing up as the only scientist in an arts and humanities family, is firstly, are they actually that different? You know, scientia means to know, nauka in Russian is just knowledge, that covers all forms of academic inquiry. And humanities, just like us biologists, value reproducibility, objectivity, critical thinking, rigor. They try to get to the truth, and they try to develop that truth using theory and methods. So I think let's put that aside maybe and think, okay, so one of the core things we need to do nowadays in conservation science is to understand that the Western scientific method in which we were all trained, which is hardwired into the way we do our work, we grew up with it. It's not the only worldview, though, that needs to be at the table. Other worldviews, religion, indigenous peoples' worldviews, must be there at the table. And then here's the hard bit, and I find it hard. They must have equal weight. I find that very hard, but that is true. So I think that's a core point, perhaps, of where we need to focus this debate. Is that everybody's view? Academics have a very special position in our society. We're publicly funded to do research and education for the public good. What a privilege. How lucky we all are to have that. We have a duty to engage with wider society as a result of this public funding and to use this privilege wisely. Now, different people sit on different ends of the spectrum of interdisciplinarity, so working with other disciplines inside the academy, and transdisciplinarity, working with external people. In my academic career, through my entire academic life, I've found the most exciting place to be intellectually is at those boundary zones. So whether it's boundaries between disciplines, sector, or boundaries between the academy and external actors, that's intellectually, for me, very exciting. And being able to make a positive difference in the world. So those are the things that motivate me, but that's not for everyone. It's not for everyone, and that's absolutely fine. One of the things I've done for nearly 20 years now is to run an NGO, the Saiga Conservation Alliance. It came out of my PhD work. So I'm right out on the edge of that grey zone of where academia meets the rest of the world. But I feel that NGO running has improved my teaching. You can't teach conservation science, in my opinion, unless you've done it. Fed and enriched my research, trained many students, allowed me to influence policy and practice around the world. It's contributed to Research Excellence Framework case studies of impact, and it's brought me to the sharp end of conservation. So I think it's only benefited my academic career. Of course, we need to protect our integrity, our trusted position as academics. But surely if we have understanding, we need to share it. And perhaps more contentiously, to gain that understanding, we need to get our boots muddy. We need to experiment and we need to engage. And for conservation scientists, that means engaging as academics in real-world conservation. So that's all I have to say, and I'm really looking forward to this debate.
Thank you, EJ. All right, Tim, let's hear your perspective on this.
So I'm your pantomime villain, I suspect. Anyway, thanks very much for arranging this discussion. And to be honest, I suspect there's going to be much agreement, despite some points of discussion. And clearly this topic is of interest, and I hope it starts a broader discussion. Looking out there, I'm amazed that this number of people want to come and listen to EJ and me discuss these things we've been doing for many years. Believe it or not, our families even went on holiday together 25 years ago. So EJ and I have worked together, we've published together, and we know one another well. So we're not going to fall out over this. It's going to be a fun discussion. But I think a starting point is we are all concerned about biodiversity loss and want to come about ways of trying to reverse that loss. There's not going to be a single solution that is going to work in every case. I think we would agree with that. But I've kind of been thinking about how do we get here, because a bit like EJ, I'm kind of a bit nonplussed that I'm sat on stage having this discussion. But I had lunch with Leah in Jesus College, and I had the sort of typical Oxford College conversation. So I sort of said, what are you up to? Why did you change your research direction? And I didn't really get a good answer. And then I sort of said, as you do in these lunches, I said, well, so how is social science, the social science approach you're taking, making a difference to biodiversity? I then pushed a little bit, didn't really get an answer. And then the next thing I know, I was on stage discussing it with EJ. So thanks very much for that, Leah. But it's great having you visiting in Oxford. So I think it's all good fun, it's all interesting, and I'm looking forward to an open debate. As I said, so I completely understand as well how many researchers want to make the world a better place. Doesn't mean everyone wants to do that. So for many ecologists, this means trying to slow the loss of biodiversity. Many healthcare researchers want to reduce disease burden. Material scientists want to make and strive to create useful new compounds. And so that's going on everywhere, and lots of people want to do that. But not everyone wants to do applied research. Many researchers aim, and this is where I come from, aim to try and understand the universe without tinkering with it. We want to know how it works. And I guess what surprised me after the discussion with Leah was the existence of what I kind of came across, a group of conservation scientists, researchers, with pretty strong and fairly strident views that they are making the world a better place by doing what they argue is interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary science. And I kind of got intrigued by this, as I must admit I had not really noticed a significant improvement in biodiversity around the world. But the main topic, I suspect, that we're all interested in is how do we go about preserving biodiversity. And so my experience, both through reading very widely, through researching this for about as long as EJ, we got our PhDs about the same time, is the evidence points me very clearly to the fact that people are poor at living with wildlife. I think the historical evidence, which I consider pretty solid, is that outside of Africa, the hunter-gatherer lifestyles are incompatible with megafauna. I say that because we know that Europe, Asia, Australia, North America, and South America lost 82% of their large animals within a millennia or two of our ancestors arriving from that. We know that as the Polynesian islands were colonized, the Polynesians, there's a recent Nature paper on this, were responsible of causing more vertebrate extinctions than any other culture on Earth. We also know that that when our ancestors, sorry, just following my notes here, yeah. So despite the fairly clear evidence on different time scales as we reach different continents, Australia about 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, North America and South America sort of 16.5 to 14,000 years ago, people are still blaming climate change for this, and they're not accepting that humans had this responsibility. Jumping more recently, we know that non-mechanized farming, where between 20% and 50% of people are required to produce food for the whole population, is also largely incompatible with most forms of wildlife, from intermediate-sized vertebrates up. And certainly in the last couple of centuries, you know, so for example, when Europeans colonized America, there was a second wave of extinction, where large numbers of species were certainly driven locally extinct. And that didn't reverse until urbanization started to happen. And we're now down to a point where about 1% of people in the UK are involved in food production, 1.5% in Europe, 1%, about 1.5% in America. And when that happens, you start to see wildlife recovering. So you see that in the mountains and the mountainous regions of both America and Europe when people moved off the land. And so I think the evidence points that actually we're not very good at living with wildlife. And I struggle to see evidence of cases, of compelling cases, where that narrative isn't correct. I'm happy to be proven wrong. I will follow the evidence. And so I think that this history tells us that expecting largely subsistence farmers to live alongside long-term with animals that can kill them, their crops, eat their crops, or kill their livestock is largely unrealistic. That's not where the evidence points. It might work for short periods of time in some localities, but it is not a long-term viable solution. Sadly, I think we do need to give animals space. And I think if we do that, and I don't mind other approaches being attempted, but I think if we do that, we have all sorts of opportunities and possibilities to actually help preserve biodiversity whilst we address the existential threat of climate change, which is also going to be an extremely hard problem to save. So I suppose one of the concerns that I have is I've met a lot of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary conservation scientists over the last few months. I've spoken to them, I've gone to seminars, and what surprises me, I don't see them at any other seminars apart from that sort of thing. I don't see them at sort of Planets Day, for example. I was talking about seminars on aging. It seems very, very narrow, and I'm worried that an echo chamber is developing. And that's going to be my pantomime villain line for the rest of this debate. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think I'll start with a really general question for both of you. So what motivates you as an academic scientist? Like what makes you wake up in the morning and go to work? What are you excited about?
Just like any other academic, I'm excited about new ways of thinking, new discoveries. Tim and I are both population modelers, I guess. And I still love population modelling and always have a little strand of that. But also, I guess, I am a terrible kind of meddler, Protestant work ethic kind of person who just loves to make things better. I think the best anecdote probably which will help you understand is that when I was 13, we were very worried about nuclear war. And so we had a careers fair at school, and I went up and I said, I want to be Prime Minister. How can I do that? And they said, oh, you've got to join a political party first. And I thought, oh, it's a bit dull. Don't want to do that. So yeah, I've always been someone who wants to make things better, but there's an intellectual side to it as well.
So I guess my anecdote was when first time I was taken to the seaside, which was, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. Apparently I stood on the beach for 3 or 4 minutes, and then I looked at my parents and I said, why is the sea going up and down, looking at the waves? And I've always, as far as I can remember, just wanted to understand how the world works. I love that science has forged the modern world. I love that it's improved living standards for many, but not everyone. I think it's given us a remarkable understanding of why we exist. I nearly became first of all, I wanted to be a physicist when I then actually had a place to read maths at university, and I decided I wanted to do biology because it's the hardest science. And it really is the hardest science. I mean, complex systems many complex systems, including social systems, and trying to understand those gives me a real kick. I think there are 2 types of scientists, and Václav Smil says this in his book, How the World Really Works. There are specialists who he describes as digging deep holes, and what he means by that is they become very, very specialist in a particular area. They become world leaders in it, and that is the best way to get a job in academia. But the problem with that is you're kind of dug a big hole, you're a specialist, and you can only see a tiny bit of the sky. And there are those others who aren't specialists at anything really, but perhaps have a broader view. And I've always wanted to be the latter, and that's probably why I ended up writing a book on the history of the universe.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a somewhat provocative question that came up in many of the discussions, and I'll start with EJ. So has academia had any meaningful impact on conservation outcomes?
Well, I've got to say yes, haven't I? I think that the discipline of conservation science, which I distinguish from conservation biology, underpins a very large proportion of the policy that we have, international and national. I know that the targets that we have in global biodiversity agreements are politically negotiated, but that 30 by 30 target, the target that requires us to have large amounts of protected area, the target that highlights the role of consumption, production and unfair subsidies, all those things are based on evidence and science underpinning them. If you go down to the kind of smaller level, the kinds of incentives that people try now around protected areas or with working with consumers, all of those are actually informed by evidence from science. So I think pretty much, I don't think conservation has particularly progressed by trial and error. There's some of it, but I think a lot of it is progressed based upon evidence that has seeped through from the academy.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you a different question because I suspect I know your answer to that one. And then I'm going to give an opportunity for others to ask questions. So, Tim, this is something, I come from a very different institution, Arizona State University. It's a big state university that, we're all about inclusion of everyone. And, any idea floats, and Oxford is very traditional. And so something I think about that I've reflected on over my time here is how do we navigate this space where we want rigor, we want academic rigor, but we also want to allow space for applied work. How do we ensure both in academia?
So I think, of course, universities and research should be for everyone. We have to be inclusive. We need to listen to people's ideas. I'm not daft enough to sit up here and say anything other than that, obviously, but I do believe that. I think one of the problems one of the challenges I have, I'm actually going to answer your first question that you asked to EJ, in fact, because I I suspect that conservation science has had some impact, but I think it's extraordinarily difficult to measure that impact because we don't know what the world would have been like if conservation science hadn't been operating. So, and that's kind of one of I like to sort of follow the evidence. I'm sure that it must have had some positive impact, but it's hard to tell. I think in general that impact is, I think one of the problems I have is that it's very difficult to see where impact comes from. And I think the history of science tells us that. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So for example, Isaac Newton worked on two things. He worked on developing calculus, as did Leibniz, and he worked on alchemy. And to be honest, the applied work would have been on alchemy, and that's what current funding bodies would have funded. It's impossible to put an estimate of the impact of calculus on the modern world. It has completely changed it. A more recent example is in 2017, a paper was submitted to a computing conference, and it was titled, "Attention is All You Need." It was rejected as a talk, but they were allowed to give a poster. It came out in 2017. It's now cited 173,000 times. It was done as pure research, it wasn't impact. And the reason it's so important is it revolutionized general AI by addressing a particular focus on seek-to-seek techniques. You don't end up getting significant impact just by saying, I'm going to go and do some applied research and do it. Well, you know what the problems are. Some of those you can apply. A kind of flip example is the generation of the Oxford malaria vaccine, and also the various COVID vaccines that came out. That's a real positive thing that was driven by trying to find a solution to a particular problem. But my view is you need both types of things, and I guess I get a little bit alarmed at, I think you can be an applied scientist and a pure scientist, and I really don't like this dichotomy that we were forced to vote on, where there's one or another. If I have to come down on either side, I'm saying I'm a pure scientist, but of course I've advised governments, I educate. I've sat on boards of companies that I think are kind of doing positive things. So I think the distinction is actually a little bit naive and a little bit unnecessary.
You're coming around.
No, well, go on then, a little bit. But only for this audience.
Yes. Okay, so I do want to give folks in the audience a chance to ask questions. I know there's been a lot of discussion, so I'll give folks a chance, and I'll be looking on the Zoom chat as well to see what has popped up.
Thanks very much already. And I have to preface this that I'm not an academic, but I have the utmost respect for how hard academia is and the work that you'll do. I kind of want to just go back to the question. I'm really interested in this, and this might be a dumb question, but I feel like we're talking about what should be the role of academia in addressing the biodiversity crisis. And I'm just interested if there's agreement on what currently is the role of academia from a structural and funding point of view. Would you agree that the system globally, because I'm aware of what happens in Oxford, favours the more pure or favours the applied as one in terms of, are the incentive structures more towards one than the other? Just to give people like me a bit of context.
So, do you want me to start that, EJ? So I think at the moment there's I think that perhaps not so much this government, but certainly the last government kind of came to the opinion that they said, oh, look, we've got a problem. Oh, why don't we just go and ask those scientists to solve that problem? So what we'll do, we'll put money more into answering applied questions. That's fine. I mean, people then apply for that money and then do it. It's a very naive view of the government on actually how scientific and even social science progress is made. The history of science doesn't say that. So, but the scientists are going to follow the money. I mean, that's always the case. I mean, I was thinking about this, EJ will come up with a different list. I was thinking, who would be the kind of names that I would choose for probably who have done most for conservation in a broad sense. I don't necessarily meaning being on the ground. And I think the people that in the public's mind, not necessarily the people in this room, I think David Attenborough would be probably up there. I think Jane Goodall would be up there for her work on chimpanzees and bringing that to the fore. I meant to write a list down, but I've forgotten them. I think Probably some of the really wealthy funders who are putting money into this space have probably made a fairly significant impact. And in general, well, there's some very good academics working in this area. I think the people who've had real impacts are probably not working in academia. Academia obviously has something to contribute. The problem, I think, of trying to do sort of non-academic, what I would call conservation, where we're just trying to implement things and we're not trying to produce outputs from it or publications from it, is twofold. Is universities are universities, being public sector bodies, are focused on accountability, which they have to be. All public sector bodies do, including things like the NHS. They're focused on accountability, and not profitability, and that can make them very expensive. So, for example, if you're trying to fund some applied hands-on conservation through a university, you're going to have to pay overheads, and those overheads are contributing to labs, which we don't need for conservation. They're contributing to a lot of the lecture theatres, a lot of the sort of ivory towers and building things. I think that if you end up with some really good ideas in conservation, spin them out into an NGO, as EJ has done. I think that's the approach. It's a much, much better value for money approach of doing it, rather than having to support the costs of that academia put on you. And you can still collaborate, you can still work with academics. We do that all the time, we do it across the board. And in fact, I think that including, we had antimicrobial existence, that's really the way that they tend to work, whether it's in the NGOs they set up or even the social science side of it that they do. They tend to spin those things out. And I think that's a really well-trodden and effective way of doing it.
So I would say that as things stand, in much government and NGO and business policy, academics are not the first people that are asked for their views. And instead, I've spent many high-level meetings being the only academic in the room, and only being in the room because of my NGO links. So academics tend not to get in the room when big policy decisions are made. And that's partly the reason why we've got Cascade, actually, which Hannah mentioned before. I think, actually, that as public sector bodies, universities and academics have this huge luxury of having our salaries paid. We have our core salary paid in order to do what we want to do, as long as it's within the public interest. So, although implementing conservation programs for the sake of conservation, I don't think that's something that the Academy should do. I agree with you. I think providing evidence that allows people to make better choices, better decisions, is something we absolutely fundamentally should be doing, and we're not doing it enough. So what I would love to have more than anything, and have been trying to do this for many years, is to have academic scientists and NGOs or governments co-designing large-scale programs for implementation, where the science is part of the way in which it's actually designed, so that you can then do a controlled trial or an impact evaluation or whatever it is, and working together throughout that process to implement. And I think where it's been strongest, it has had that model, which I think probably Tim would like too as a model.
I would agree with that. I think the approach that I would try and take, though, is rather than necessarily working with government to influence policy, which I don't think often gets us very far, is trying to work with industry. And I think working with industry, which are often the polluters, which are often the ones that are doing the damage, is probably the way to go. And actually, I know you're doing a lot of that, Leah. And I know you've done that as well. It's hard to work with business. It's hard to work with industry. It's also unpalatable to some people because it feels like you're working with the enemy. But unfortunately, I think that's one thing. I'm not saying don't do policy, but I just think, it's hard to influence policy, and policy changes and is often made on the hoof, as depending what the politicians read on the front page of the newspapers each morning.
I mean, I don't think it's an either-or in any way. So, we work with industry bodies, we work with NGOs, we work with government. And actually, I think working with civil servants is particularly valuable. We have had huge interest from government for evidence provided by academic institutions in the right way. So I think for all of these people, it's about understanding how best to engage with them rather than saying, do sector A rather than sector B. I mean, we're all on this planet. We all have to have a role in addressing the biodiversity crisis.
I agree working with both, but remember, industry is a very powerful policy lobby as well. So that's why working with them is key.
I see a couple of hands all the way in the back first, and then midway through. So go ahead. Yes.
Thanks very much. It's a really interesting conversation. And thanks, Tim, for highlighting the problems of trying to polarize something where there's so much nuance. I'm just curious about a couple of things you said. And I was curious why in your initial intervention you focused on the role of sort of poaching and smallholder farmers when academic research has indicated that industrial agriculture and industrialized fishing is actually the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss on land and the sea, which is in turn driven by overconsumption in the West, which is in turn driven by a very broken socioeconomic system, which is based on extraction and commodification and exploitation. And I'd wanted to know, I have this question for you around, I think that it might be the absence of the application of ecological knowledge and thinking to the economy and how we run the economy, which may well be at the root cause of the crisis we face. We need an economy that grows like a rainforest. We know that linear ecology teaches us that linear economics doesn't really work. That's one question. And then related to that, if I may, you painted a very bleak picture about what humanity is. And I think we know now there's evidence emerging more and more about how many indigenous communities and local communities have worked with nature as part of nature around the world. You sort of, the narrative you described was one around the tragedy of the commons and the ubiquity of that. I would argue that we now have evidence to suggest that this is a function of industrialization and of the agricultural revolution. And actually, there are many, many examples of where local communities are really working in balance. Clam Gardens in the Northwest Pacific coast, Cool Burn Fire by the Aborigines in Australia is two prominent examples, but there are many more. And there are no ecosystems on Earth that haven't been tinkered with the ecosystem engineer that ecology teaches us. People are. So I would say that actually there's some fascinating work on the social ecological system that demands we bring together diverse knowledge systems that ultimately recognize that we're all part of a web of life, we're all kin, and we all depend upon one another. But how do we apply that to the management of our ecosystems? And related to that, it's very clear that in a rapidly cooling world, we're going to need to adaptively manage our ecosystems. So conservation is not about keeping people out of ecosystems, but working out how people can work with ecosystems to boost their resilience as the climate warms.
Okay, so thank you. I think, as I said at the beginning as well, I think we need to, we need to be open to other voices. There's no doubt about that. I think there's a very considerable amount of naivety about the state of the planet and where we need to get to. We have changed the carbon cycle, we've changed the water cycle, we have changed the geochemical cycles, and we're not about to suddenly reverse those. 1950 was the last year when natural processes moved more material, sediment, water, earth than humans. 1950. People talk very glibly about, we're going to go through the next energy transition. In order to go through the next energy transition, and this is just one number, we need 900 megatons of copper. Currently, we use in extraction and recycling 20 megatons of copper. There is 900 megatons of copper on the planet, but in order to get that, you will need to mine the oceans. There's no doubt about that. In order to do that in a manner that is not going to, we're addicted to fossil fuels. We're not going to be able to break that addiction anytime soon. I wish we could go through the energy transition, but in order to do that in the most sustainable manner that we can, whilst relying on the carbon we'll need to burn to extract that copper, we're going to want to do it with natural gas because that's better to burn than it's better to burn oil. In order to get that natural gas, we need to frack. But this is an incredibly unpopular thing to say to conservation biologists. I think there's a real naivety about how the world actually works. And I think there's an echo chamber where people are not engaging with those experts in energy transitions, those experts in human population growth, those experts in developing new materials that help us get through this. I am an optimist. I think we can get there. But I think in order to get there, we need our ecosystems, and I think you would agree with this, in order to provide functions. And I think the best way that we can provide many of those functions is by giving them space. So yes, indigenous knowledge is useful. I don't have a problem with that. But a lot of that indigenous knowledge comes from a very different world to the world we live in now. We're living in a world of 8 billion people. On the plus side, the population growth rate is slowing. Some people suspect we may have already hit peak human population. I think that's a bit optimistic, but I think we'll hit it before the UN guidelines suggest. And we don't know how to get through the damage we're doing on the Earth. To suggest there's some indigenous populations that can manage the Earth of 8 billion better is fantastic if it's true, but I'm sorry, I'm skeptical.
Yep, and then we have some more questions.
Tim, I just think you've got a very old-fashioned view of what a conservation scientist is. Or you keep saying conservation biologist. So conservation scientist is someone who goes to seminars outside of their field, doesn't sit in an echo chamber. You will find them in seminars in the economics department, in the Blavatnik School of Government, in those kinds of places. You won't necessarily find them in a biology department seminar, but that's because they're interdisciplinary. And I think they have a full understanding. Well, no, okay. I think conservation science is so much more about systems change now than it is about the small guy at the edge of protected areas. So large part of my career I spent thinking about how to incentivize the little subsistence farmer by the edge of a protected area to do the right thing and to reduce the amount of non-timber forest products they were taking, or bushmeat, or whatever. I had a kind of revelation a few years ago now, in which I realised, having been out to these places where large-scale industrial farming, large-scale industrial activity, infrastructure, whatever, that is the driver of biodiversity loss. And if we focus on the small guy, then we've lost the battle already. I agree with you that nature needs space. Nature needs some kind of cultural understanding as well. So I think, the only way we're going to solve this is to take the guys who are thinking about deep sea mining, the guys who are thinking about population, and those who are thinking about nature, and bring them together. And my experience in this university, sorry to get on around, is that it's incredibly hard to bring biodiversity into that discussion. I spent my time on the Environmental Sustainability Subcommittee before we got the university strategy saying, and biodiversity, pretty much every time someone spoke, and we still have to do it. So I think unless we get better at people understanding that the energy transition and all the rest of it requires natural functions as well as artificial functions, we're going to end up on a planet that's unlivable. So I think we probably agree with a lot of things.
No, I think we do. And I'm just not necessarily... The seminars that I go to, I hope you're right. I actually really hope you're right. But I have had quite a few conversations where I think there's a lot of naivety about actually what is required to get through the next energy transition, and how we maintain biodiversity as the human population peaks and demand for food goes up by another 40% and demand for copper goes up by double what we're at the moment. All of those things, we need to kind of get through that. And despite the claims of colossal, once an animal has gone extinct, we're not bringing it back from extinction. And I think we completely agree with that as well. So I think there's a lot of agreement. I'm happy, maybe I am old-fashioned. I don't think so. I mean, I do go to those energy talks. I do go to those kind of material talks. I mean, and I kind of spend my time going to seminars in all sorts of places, which is kind of where I've kind of become... I think we can do it, but it's going to be bloody hard. And I think sometimes as biodiversity scientists, as we are, we're not making our case very clearly or compellingly in that arena. And I think by appealing to indigenous knowledge, and no, this is not to insult indigenous knowledge in any way, it just doesn't land, right? It doesn't land, unfortunately.
So maybe I do see a couple of other hands. Molly.
Thanks so much. I was wondering, Tim, if you could elaborate a bit on what you see as when you say nature needs space. Because I think I agree with that in the way I have it in my mind, but I'd be interested to hear what you think. Because I think there's potentially this dichotomy of there's people and nature as very separate entities. So how can we achieve nature having more space without people in it and still achieve an energy transition? What would that ideal world look like where nature has space to you?
So it would look like a world with many less people on it. And I know that's very, very difficult to achieve. The carrying capacity of the human population on this planet before the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, which generates the nitrates that we use for fertilizer, would have been probably about 3 billion, maybe 4 billion. We'd double what our carrying capacity would be within the absence of that chemical process. That makes it very, very hard for us in order to make space for nature. The way that the human population will come down is, it is coming down in the developed world, and it comes down through female education. That's very well known. Everyone understands that. There's very good evidence that that's the case. And as it comes down and people urbanize, and you end up being, you do need, in order to feed that number of people, you need to intensively farm land. At the moment it takes, it's really interesting actually. So in places like Europe, it takes 2 seconds of human activity, of one person's activity, to produce a kilogram of grain. Before the mechanization of agriculture, it was about 10 to 15 minutes of people. And that allows urbanization. Once urbanization occurs and people move off the land, you start to see nature recover. So you see a really amazing place where that's happened accidentally is the mountains of Europe, for example. And it's just one example. People have left that because it's not a great life trying to farm on mountain slopes. And as they've moved over the last century, and you travel around there, I've traveled around there, I've worked in that area, and nature comes back. And I think that what we probably need to do is we need to try and get through the energy transition. It's going to be hard. The next energy transition, it's going to be hard. And we need to improve the lot of people who are still leading incredibly difficult lives. We do that through development. We do that through female education. We still need to maintain cultural differences because cultural differences are undoubtedly important. And I think if we manage to do that, we can create space. But we do need to maintain the biodiversity that we've got at the moment. And certainly for large animals, and particularly those animals that end up being ecosystem engineers, we still need to try and maintain migration routes and what have you. And this is going to be even harder given the rates of climate change that we're seeing now. So I want to be an optimist, but in my darker moments, I'm fairly pessimistic.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's important to remember is what are we holding as constants and constraints, and what are we taking as variables in this equation? And some of the things that or that society in the West anyway is holding as a constant or constraint could be a variable. I worry that we're holding biodiversity as a variable and not a constant or a constraint. And we need to change that. But things like our food system, we have to reduce rapidly the amount of meat we eat. We have to massively improve the efficiency of our water, etc., etc., etc. That requires behavioural change. That requires the social scientists. So I think, let's think more flexibly about how we get to these places.
I have no problem along that, but just one thing. It takes between 1.5 and 2.5 litres of oil to produce a kilogram of tomatoes. Chicken, believe it or not, is much less energy intensive to produce.
Of course, so that's energy, but there's a whole lot of other variables there, aren't there?
There are, but it's like, I think there's some politics that sneak into some of these, into some of these discussions. And I completely agree with you. We need to, we need to change our diets. We need to eat locally. We need to cut down on meat. I think it's unrealistic to expect the entire Western population to stop eating meat. I have cut down significantly. I'm a facultative vegetarian, so when I'm at home, I eat meat. When I go at home, I eat vegetables. When I go out, I eat meat.
Okay, so I have a number of questions here that I want to get to. I do see a couple of hands. Did you want to go? Yes.
This is fun. This is fun and serious. So thanks. So I'm a professor, and I think a lot about the role of academia in everything. So I want to get back to the question. I wonder if we have 8 hours in a day and we have to pick what we spend our time on. Say we have to pick one thing. What would it be? And I want to propose that we do what academia does best, which is not logistics, it is not politics, it is not literally organizing anything, but inspiring, educating, training, engaging, because I think that you can have an outsized impact by doing that, right? Whereas your one tiny brain probably cannot solve the biodiversity crisis, but maybe somebody under your wing can, or a group of people. And the people you mentioned, they didn't learn about the environment in a vacuum, right? Somebody taught them. So my question to you is that a cop-out, or is that the smartest thing to do?
And I'm going to add a nuance to that question, which is, if you were to advise an early career scientist who's motivated by making an impact, what would be your advice? And I do want to recognize, as you pointed out, that we're looking at these in sort of a black and white context, and really there's quite a bit of nuance. And I think you bring up this legitimate point that we don't all have to be one way. And in fact, working in a community or with a team that has different types of expertise and interests is what leads to outcomes. So we don't all have to be applied, and we don't all have to be excellent science communicators. But so with that nuance, and I'll turn to EJ, what would you say if someone came to you and said, I really am passionate about the biodiversity loss, I'm early in my career, where should I go? What should I do?
So I think they're two very different questions. So let's start with the question from the floor. And I do really agree with you in many ways. So the proudest thing that I've produced is 400 plus people who are out there in the world, having done master's courses, PhDs or whatever with me. So I find that, incredibly inspiring that there are those people out there who are doing wonderful things and that I've had some small part to play in taking them out there. So I agree with you in that. I also think, though, that you have to have some real experience yourself. You have to build that inspiration, that capacity, that whatever, on real understanding that you have to gain yourself. So there's a bit of, a bit of both.
So I completely agree with the question on the floor that academia should, it can't solve all of the problems. I also agree with what EJ said in terms of it's a real privilege to be an academic. It's great to teach really smart people. I agree with that. I kind of measure success now in terms of who's gone through my lab and is kind of doing great research or doing great work for an NGO or great work for government. I completely agree with that. In terms of the second question about what would I ask, what advice would I give to someone who really wants to make an impact? I think I'd say don't go into biology. I'd say I don't think ecology actually does provide. It's not going to solve. An understanding of ecology is not going to solve the world's problems. I would say try and become an environmental lawyer or make a lot of money and give something back, I think would be my argument. Both of my daughters, they toyed with academia and we just sort of discussed it. Both of them wanted to make a difference. One did physics, one did maths. And they both work in the private sector, but they're both kind of working for companies that are trying to lower environmental impacts. One through making medical devices that are less energy intensive, small 3D scanners, and one who's working for a large engineering company trying to improve railways and make them more environmentally sustainable. They've certainly had more impact than me, and they're way younger than I am.
So my advice to the early career researcher who wants to make an impact is there's so many different ways to have an impact, and try to think about what motivates you, what gets you up in the morning, what you love to do, because that's going to be the best way to keep you going through the years of making an impact. So I think I wouldn't advise someone to go into, I don't know, politics or even environmental law unless they were passionate about it and good at it. You know, we have to be good at something in order to be able to make an impact. So I think I would delve deeper into their motivations and their strengths before I made any sweeping view.
Of course, I took that for granted.
I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chat here and also then pass it to the audience. So here's one. I think, I'm not sure who it's for, but I'll read it. So why do some people still view Indigenous knowledge as a relic of the past, when in reality, it's an evolving and modern body of knowledge that has been continuously adapted to changing environmental conditions and challenges? Indigenous people are actively adapting their practices to modern environmental challenges. How can we see Indigenous knowledge systems as cutting-edge tools for ecological resilience and sustainability rather than outdated methods? Who wants to have a go at that?
Well, so I think I'm kind of being, I think people think that I'm in some ways anti-non-Western knowledge. That's not true. I'm completely supportive. And that's absolutely right. People adapt, people learn and what have you. Of course, we want to listen to those, that knowledge and that understanding. There's no doubt that people understand the environments that they live in. I have no doubt about that. Whether that's going to save us and its contribution to saving biodiversity is less clear to me. I have no doubt that when population density is low, and population density is relatively low, that people are able to manage that biodiversity in a very effective manner. But I struggle to understand how it's going to help us as we go above 8 billion towards 9 billion. I think that's my concern. We should listen to it because maybe the answer is out there, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be the golden bullet that some people are proposing.
I mean, there is no golden bullet, is there?
No.
It's going to be a patchwork of different ideas and views. And like I said at the beginning, I think, Western science knowledge is one of those, and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous culture is another very much overlooked and neglected source of culture and understanding. I do really think that one of the byproducts of the kind of system that we're in is that we lose our connection to nature. We lose our children's ability to actually understand and be out in nature. And if we lose that, then we lose a lot. And a lot of the things that we can be taught from people who are more closely aligned to nature are about actually what does nature mean to the human psyche, and that's important.
I don't doubt that at all. How that changes our culture is less clear to me, though.
Thank you very much for your fascinating sharing. And my question is about, there are some research centers, when their impact documents, they emphasize too much on the technical solutions rather than the knowledge inclusion or the overlooked, as you emphasize, of the indigenous communities. So how do impact metrics can make positive changes to combat the biopolitics and to self-criticize the politics of knowledge? And for so to your perspective, what's hopeful solutions or ways that can make that you want to make changes to the impact metrics? Thank you very much.
That's a great question, and I think certainly in this country we're much broader now in understanding that having a real-world difference is an important part of a university, and that as well as counting number of citations, they also count, real stories of impact more and more. So in this country, the Research Excellence Framework on which we're all judged does have quite an important impact section. So that's good. It's not true in many other countries, and it's not entirely true still in the UK because I think promotion and appointment decisions are still very much around publications. I think we need to, and part of the point of this talk is that we need to redefine and think about what is the role of the academy in our culture, and in our future. And the role of the academy, to me, should be much more inclusive and should be much more broad in its understanding of what does knowledge mean and what does a contribution to knowledge mean than we are at the moment. My personal approach, which has worked for me, because here I am, but doesn't work for everyone, I guess, because I've been very, very lucky and very privileged, is to do what I want to do and ignore impact metrics. But I know that that's not always possible, and people who are disadvantaged, people don't have the privileges that I have, are swallowed up by that kind of approach. So the more we can be kind and open and understanding of the different ways in which members of our academy are having impact, the better.
I have a question for you, Tim. Came up in the chat. It takes a fairly substantial degree of privilege to prioritize discovery over impact. If the university doesn't take on a leading role in the biodiversity crisis, what other institution might be trusted?
So, it does take a certain amount of privilege. But my point is, I don't think we can just say, I'm going to go and solve this problem. And we wouldn't be having this discussion if we knew how to solve the biodiversity problem. And the point that I made earlier is you don't necessarily solve problems by just saying, go and solve that problem. You find, the examples I gave earlier are cases where it's been pure science. We're trying to understand how things work for the sake of understanding how it's worked, has led to major industries. It's led to most of I would argue it's led to most of the development of the modern world. So I think it's a very dangerous thing to do, to change away from what we know has worked in the past, to say, just work on these things that we think you can solve, because I think we would then miss many of the key things that allow us to solve those problems. The breakthrough technologies, many of them, we've never spotted them coming. We don't see them coming. And those are the ones that have often gone and changed the world. And I think by just saying, okay, Tim, go out and save the world, everyone should be doing this, everyone should be doing what I'm doing, saving the world, I think that risks us not actually making the breakthroughs that really make a difference. And that comes from the history of academia, to be honest. I think, it's, there are a mix sometimes, as I said. Sometimes trying to solve a problem does come up with breakthroughs, but that's often not the case. That's often not how you solve problems. I think that's a really important lesson from science. In terms of impact, one of the, in general, the whole spread of human knowledge goes from pure, correct proofs in mathematics that you don't, they are right, we know they are right, and they describe the world well, through repeatable experiments where physicists, for proof, require something to be 5 standard deviations away from the mean, 5 sigma, right the way through to historical narratives that are based on people doing their best to tell a story based on the or a narrative based on the information that they've got. There's no opportunities for experiments. One of the challenges that we have in biodiversity research is it is a complex system. It's an unpredictable system, and I mean it's never going to be predictable by that. It's difficult to get large amounts of data and large amounts of evidence in many cases. And so we're right on this border where we're sort of between science and where there is the possibility of doing some quite repeatable experiments, right the way through to a kind of more historical narrative where it's not possible to collect data along those lines. I work on, the reason I'm a modeler and try and use mathematics to do this is I work on systems where we can't do experiments. And my view is we can build models of these things, and if those models are reasonable approximations of the world, they can be useful. And that's kind of why I still do modeling. And going back to one of the other questions, if I have a day when I don't have to go to a meeting or sit up on a stage talking to people, I would just love to get up and try and sort of do some coding or write down some equations. And that's kind of one of the, and I think you're probably the same there, EJ.
Yeah, so just coming back, a provocation to you about blue skies discovery science, and I love it, and there's always got to be a role for that, and is that you're picking out anecdotes, the kind of 1 or 2 times in which, huge human progress has been made against the thousands of times when people have been frankly self-indulgent and sat there doing some stuff that has no interest and no use and is never going to have any use. So I think, we have to be a little bit careful by saying we've got to spend lots of time on blue skies thinking, having not done the impact evaluation, just like you're saying we should do the impact evaluation of the other way around. We should do the impact evaluation in both directions.
I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, and then perhaps we can do some assignment in a way that kind of, you're never going to get the public good perfectly optimized, are you? But we can optimize in a middle way. And I think coming to impact evaluation, part of the problem is that we just don't do it enough. There's lots of different ways to evaluate impact beyond the experimental, as you know, and beyond modelling. More of that in the academy would be great.
Go ahead.
So my question is kind of, I think, counter to the one you just read out, sort of saying that it's a privilege of academia. I would suggest that maybe it's not a privilege, but a right of a modern civilization to have the brightest minds doing the things they want to do, because that's where progress will be made. But the idea, though, is to get every bright mind who has that ability to be able to do that research, right? So the privilege is that we're in the place, not that we're able to do what we do, if that makes sense. Maybe I said that badly, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that in an ideal world, or the thing we should be striving for, is every bright mind that's capable of doing that research in the thing they want to do. If they were able to do that, then progress would be made, rather than thinking about the problems to solve. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Maybe just picking up something that EJ just said about understanding of what public good is and how we can conceive of an impact assessment based on that public good. We see in the United States a different conception of the public good coming in, and therefore impact assessment is being changed and applied science. Therefore, is at more risk perhaps than pure discovery science. I just wondered if you might have some thoughts about where we would put morality and the understanding of value in the scientific discourse. I think most of us are probably materialists and not post-structuralists, but can we separate, what's the space for value and morality in scientific judgment?
Well, those are both pretty heavy questions for a quick response. And I would also say that perhaps, bright minds should also be allowed to do cultural things. They should be allowed to make films and do art and all the rest of it. So in society, wouldn't it be, and also I actually think that everyone in our society should be able to participate in science and art and culture and all the rest of it, and that's the thing that we've been working towards. Why not? You shake your heads, but I think a lot of people have a lot of things to give that they're not able to do. But I think that is a privilege of the Western world and of a space in which we are, able to spend that time to do these things, and that's not the reality of the rest of the world potentially.
So I kind of agree that I think a sign of a civilized society is that, discovery science, impact science, arts, culture, all of those things, people are free to do it. And I'm not an enormous fan of what's going on in the US at the moment. I think it's, I always get very worried when I see kind of erosion of education opportunities and science of any form, whether it's pure science or whether it's applied science.
What is the role of academia in addressing the biodiversity crisis? Is there a role? I think what I've heard is that there's not a ton of disagreement, that there is a space for basic research and there's a space for applied research. It's not one or the other, but recognizing that plurality of roles in advancing use-inspired discovery.
I think that summary was correct. Of course, there's a role for academia in biodiversity, and it's probably more than one role. The question is, are we being effective? And that will be the subject of our next debate.
Any comments or observations? There were a handful of folks who were very engaged in conversations over the past couple of months that led to this event. So I especially would welcome thoughts from those individuals.
Thank you so much. It was a really, really interesting discussion. And I'm asking this question, or would be interested in both of your perspectives, from the perspective of somebody who is a bit of a baby of the impact culture. My PhD was impact focused. My postdoc, I was hired because I specialise in transdisciplinary and applied research. And I wanted to kind of jump back, and I think both of you touched on this dichotomy between discovery and between impact. And I can't separate those things in my mind. To me, new knowledge and new ideas is absolutely infused with your experiences, your interactions between people, your observations, your day-to-day life, your experiences in working for other organisations, a conversation that you have with your mum at the weekend. Knowledge is not a static object. Knowledge is also not directional. There is no linear direction between the creation of knowledge and some kind of impact, whether that's in policy or any other space in industry. And I just see it as any kind of more experience infusing and recognizing the fact that knowledge is very messy and it's constantly changing and adapting is a good thing. But I'd be really interested in other perspectives as well, and how you can kind of foster that culture and awareness a bit more that those two things just aren't separate, and I can't separate them in my mind.
And John has a comment. I'm going to take another.
Seeing as I was one of those who stuck my oar in originally, that was incredibly interesting. It's going to take me at least a week to think through everything that's been said. But I think everybody would recognise that we're part of a bigger picture. And you've talked about policy, you've talked about industry. We didn't talk very much about the NGOs. There's a lot of people with whom we need to be working at various times. It makes it very difficult to do that if we cannot clearly articulate what we're bringing to the party, even if that's quite a broad selection. So I think probably one of our next challenges is to be able to express very clearly, this is what we as academia can do and what we can't do. And then, to use a sporting analogy, then we can make decisions on when we should be playing the ball ourselves and when we should be passing the ball to somebody else. But if it's all one big fuzzy broad church, then that possibly doesn't help us.
Comments from EJ and Tim on the last couple of questions?
I mean, I'm with you, Caitlin. I think you're absolutely right that, maybe that's the mark of someone who's a natural researcher, is that you find inspiration everywhere and bring that into your work and bring your work back out into the world. So, yeah.
I think I agree with both of those points. Yeah. I think it's a good way to finish. And I look forward to discussing with you all. And hopefully you don't think I'm as villainous as some people thought I was at the beginning.
Well, I just want to thank everyone. I thought this was a really thought-provoking discussion, and I appreciate that a lot of different perspectives were shared in a respectful way. And, again, this is not a black and white discussion. I think there's a plurality of roles and within academia. And to John's point, I think that's an interesting proposition to think about, making clear what our offering is when within the academy there are so many potential roles. Another theme that we didn't get into is, what do academic institutions, what should we be doing to support this plurality of different paths that may diverge from the traditional basic science? So some common themes are, be true to yourself and what motivates you and what inspires you, and also align that with where you see a potential for impact. And I think you make a really good point that there is a potential for impact in doing basic science. Find a good team, take care of yourself. Those are some of the other principles that came up. And of course, we can disagree respectfully. Wouldn't this be a wonderful model for the world? No,
it wouldn't.
And we will, I'm hoping, this is my first time using Mentimeter, that we'll be able to capture all those. So we'll churn a little, and feel free to reach out if you're interested in moving this discussion forward. and not necessarily in the context of a manuscript. I saw someone put up there, not a paper. So yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you all.